making a short recording today about Bethany Bookshop or Bethany Bookstore, just to give you a little history of it and the function of it, which is probably much more important. Occasionally when I'm preaching, this is Colin Tyler, occasionally when I'm preaching I may mention books, and I mention that I have them available, but I don't do a lot of it because I'm not using the preaching ministry in order to sell books. But I think Christian books are vitally important and extremely helpful. So I'll tell you a little bit about why I started the ministry up and what you can expect to find. Occasionally I refer to it, and possibly even on the website it might be called Bethany Bookshop, but really it's just a storeroom at the church hall. It's not done for profit. I do make profit on some of the books, but I make losses on others. I try to aim to break even, and most of the books will go out at around cost. You'll find on the site it's referred to as Bethany Bookshop. This is because I started the ministry in 2004, and at that time I was an elder in a church in Birmingham, England, which was called Bethany Evangelical Church, and I started to work there just 2 years after the church itself folded, and I was still responsible for the property, so I thought I'd use it as a bookstore. And then since then, I'm now my second church since then, I moved all those books across and built them up considerably to where they are now stored in the church where I worship. Just as a matter of history, but perhaps worth mentioning, I started the bookshop in 2004 because of a secular book that I'd been reading, a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death by a professor of communications who's recently passed away. I think ran about 2000, 2002, somewhere around there, a man called Postman. And that book absolutely blew me away. As I say, a secular book, but the thrust of the book was the importance of print media. The thrust of the book was about how the visual media, such as a film and TV, was not nearly so beneficial as the old-fashioned print media. And although since then the internet was really after Mr. Postman's time, the principles of the outlines are very, very illuminating, and made such a powerful impression upon me about the necessity of literature and the value of literature over and above visual media, that I felt it was important to try and make good literature available. And of course, for the most part, this bookshop is Christian books, written by Christians, commentators and so forth. There are a few books by secular authors, such as, for example, Postman. I simply had to stock his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. It was for me just such a valuable and impressive read. But the great deal of what I have in my shop is Christian literature, with one or two books like Postman and a few other intelligent men, tending to be, for the most part, on the right politically, but helpful. The book site itself, and I'll give you the access link to it when I conclude here. The bookshop itself majors in defences of the King James Bible and critiques of modern Bible versions. I have been for a long time now, many years, maybe 30 years, possibly more, convinced that the purest Bible in the English language, without any question, is a King James version of 1611, and of course its update by Benjamin Blaney in 1769. But the 1769 is not a version, it's an edition of the 1611. So I have around, at the moment, probably around 50 titles on the KJV Defenses page on my site, with many, many authors, some of them from the 19th century, most of them the 20th, one or two more recent ones. Among the authors there's the brilliant John William Bergen. I've got most of his works. The man really who more than any other put me on the right track with regard to textual variants in Greek texts. John W. Bergen, William Bergen, was an Anglican dean. He was Dean of Chichester for a while, but a very learned man, and his book, The Revision Revised, was another one that absolutely blew me away. Just so delightful to read. Probably read that 3 times, I think. But among other authors, more recent, there's Jack Mormon. Jack Mormon is one of the great modern defenders of the King James Bible, although very, very poorly these last 18 months or so, and has had to retire from the ministry. At present he's in a care home, I believe, so prayers for Jack would be good. Peter Sturgis Ruckman, of course, from Florida, one of the great 20th century defenders, not only, well, more really of the KJV than of the Texas Receptors, but he does defend that too. Edward Freer Hills, again early on, mid-19th century, other great writer. King James Version defended, one of the great books, a learned man. Sam Gipp, David Otis Fuller. If you're new to the whole question of versions, David Otis Fuller's book, Which Bible, is probably one of the best to start with. Alternatively, another real good starter book is God Wrote Only One Bible by Jasper James Ray. I think that was possibly the first book on the KJV I ever read, perhaps alongside Bergen. Jasper James Ray, God Wrote Only One Bible, and David Otis Fuller, Which Bible. Those are great startups. If there's someone you want to persuade on this subject or help to see the light on this subject, those two I greatly recommend. Gail Ripplinger, she shouldn't be on the platform, of course, but her books are great. She's made some videos which I don't sell and I don't watch because she shouldn't be preaching, but nevertheless her books are very, very good. One of the first books of hers I read, New Age Versions, has had an awful lot of flack, even from good men. But with Gail Ripplinger, you have to eat the meat and spit out the bones, but there's a great deal of meat, make no mistake. F.H.A. Scrivener, contemporary with Bergen. Bergen reckoned he was the greatest textual critic of his day. He's late 19th century. A number of his very useful books, including a comparison of the various editions of the King James, like the 1611 with the 1612 and the 1613 and the 1769 and so forth. He compares those. That's a great book. And then more recently, Doug Stauffer does some great defences, some really good defences of the King James Bible. So that's one of the main sections, one of the main pages in my bookshop. As I say, around 50 titles and growing all the time. There are other pages, of course. I don't just want to be selling books on the King James. I want to edify believers of whatever stamp or whatever stripe. Even if you use the Revised Version, I still love you and still want you to be blessed and still want you to learn more of the Lord. So there's other subjects, other pages on the website, such as Doctrine and Exposition. There are commentaries, which I'll come back to in a moment. There's general interest, all sorts of subjects such as creationism and evolution and so forth. General interest, quite a big section. History and biography. There's some wonderful biographies and histories. Medical matters, books on things like vaccinations and so on. These tend to be secular authors, and there's not many of those, but they're good, worthwhile books and have been a great help to me with my physical health. Social and political issues, again, some of these are secular writers, but helpful books, I think. One or two, among the social and political issues, that are one or two exposés of conspiracies. Some conspiracies, of course, are bunk, but some of them are real. What we need to do is learn to discern between the two. There's a section on prophecy books too, which I'll go into in a moment, and there's one or two books on prayer. It's extraordinary how few books there are available today on the subject of prayer, at least by sound people. But one of the greatest authors I often mention when I'm preaching on the subject of prayer is Edward McKendry Bounds, E.M. Bounds. He was a real praying man, and his books will bless you abundantly if you want to improve your prayer life. I said I'd come back to the commentary section. Among the commentaries there are others. There's John Phillips. Now, a lot of people don't know John Phillips. He died in 2011. I think to some extent he was a protege of Stephen Alford. He was a fine preacher and has produced commentaries on almost every book of the Bible, and for the most part is King James. Occasionally he wanders off into the woods, as it were, with modern versions, but pretty rarely. And you'll find John Phillips, I think, a blessing, and I've got most of his commentaries, certainly in the New Testament, Very helpful man. Matthew Henry, of course, one of the great commentators of all time. Jack Mormon feels that he is the best commentator of all time, and you'll always be blessed by Matthew Henry. He was a Reformed man, of course, so he hadn't got much of an idea about prophecy, but devotionally he's hard to beat, if he can be beaten at all. And then going back a little further to the 17th century, there's Joseph Hall. Joseph Hall was one of the favourite commentators of George Whitefield. Very pithy, very weighty indeed, Joseph Hall. And I've got a huge volume of his called, I'm just looking at it, Contemplations of the Historical Passages of the Old and New Testaments. And that's a commentary, very weighty indeed, very perceptive, too strong for most people, far too strong for most of today's sloppy milksop Christians. But if you want meat, Joseph Hall's the man to go to. And a contemporary with Joseph Hall was the wonderful John Trapp. John Trapp commentated in the 17th century as well. He was born 1601, died I think 1668. He was a headmaster at the school near Stratford-upon-Avon, so in all probability he was teaching Shakespeare's grandchildren, or maybe even children. I can't quite do that maths at the moment. But he was a headmaster in a school just a few miles outside Stratford at a place called Weston-on-Avon, where he was also the minister. And for a time during the Civil War, he was the rector of a church out there too. But he was Spurgeon's favourite commentator, I think you'll find. If you look at the list of preachers in the back of Spurgeon's treasury, you'll find a great long list of references by John Trapp. And in one place, Spurgeon says to his trainee preachers, you'll have to get up very, very early in the morning to compete with John Trapp. And sometimes it can be a bit quaint, but weighty. My Bible is annotated left to right, start to finish, with the powerful comments of John Trapp. So I recommend him. Spurgeon, of course, the great work of Spurgeon is his Treasury of David, his comments on the Psalms. And I've got one or two of his books on sermons as well. More recently, James W. Knox from Florida. James is one of the great modern preachers, really out on his own amongst the preachers these days. Tremendous evangelical preacher is Brother James, about 10 years my junior, but I won't give you any more details than that. But brother, can he preach, and a great blessing. And I've got a good many of his New Testament commentaries and one or two of the Old Testament ones as well. Then again, going back a little further, there's A.W. Pink, who was writing in the early 20th century. His comments, though he was Reformed and Calvinistic, again, like Matthew Henry, his comments are good. He was a man truly devoted to the Lord, and you'll be blessed. And then there's Jack Mormon, as I've mentioned earlier, presently very ill, who's written some of the best commentaries you can get your hands on Daniel and Revelation. I thoroughly recommend those. Sadly, not very cheap, but then they are big books, and they're in my shop. Also, Jack's done a commentary on Genesis to the Exodus, starting from Genesis 1, going right up through Exodus 12. And of course, Jack's very, very good on the King James Version issue, one of the finest alive today, without doubt. One of the, I don't know, maybe among the top 10 in the world in defence of KJV and Textus Receptus manuscript evidence. His books are really, really useful. Very useful indeed. So those are the commentators. Now, many of these books that I stock across all the sections are not available in the UK, as far as I know, anywhere. I know of one of the bookseller who sells Ruckman in the Midlands here, but other than that, I know of hardly anyone anywhere in the UK who sells books, who stores books at least. They might be available on Amazon, such as I am stocking. Most of the books I get from the United States, and thus they're hard to get hold of over here, and I'm able to buy them in bulk, which means I can pass them on to you if you're in the UK, and that you'll probably find, and I'll just stick my neck out a little bit here, you'll probably find that most of the books that I have on my site are cheaper than you'll find anywhere, even on Amazon. As one man said, if you can find them anywhere cheaper, let me know where they are and I'll go and burn their shop down. Actually, I won't do that really, but you'll have to look long and hard with many of my books to find them cheaper anywhere else. The website is currently being updated. I'm working on that to try and make it a little bit smarter. And the Lord willing, later this year, I hope we'll be able to make online buying possible. At the moment, you have to email me and I'll check the stock, and I'll email you back and then post the book out after that. But I'm hoping, as I say, later this year. Preaching has made it very difficult up to now, but I'm semi-retired now, so hopefully later this year that the books will be available. You can order directly. The site is called KJVBooks.com. That's all lowercase, KJVBooks.com. Just to close with a quote from Shakespeare, one of the great problems these days, this is what Shakespeare's character says in Love's Labour's Lost, quote, "He hath not eat paper, as it were, he hath not drunk ink, his intellect is not replenished, he is only an animal, only sensible in the duller parts," unquote. We don't want to be like that, do we? So I recommend, if you're a keen reader, have a look at KJVBooks.com. Thank you.